Chapter 1 Part 1. My mafia parents were obsessed with the idea of having a powerful son. Not just mentally powerful, but physically dominant. From a young age, my life was controlled by training, weightlifting, combat lessons, endurance drills, strict diets. Everything was designed to make me stronger. I never had a normal childhood. I was always pushed beyond my limits. My name is Kim Lee Suong. At 15, I already stood over 6'4" and carried more than 200 pounds of muscle. But it was never enough for them. The doctors warned my parents that the medication they were giving me was affecting my growth and hormones. They told them to stop before it was too late. My parents ignored every warning. When I was 6, I begged them to stop. They locked me in the basement for a week. After that, I stopped fighting back. Chapter 1 Part 2. I obeyed. But as I got older, I started noticing strange things. Whispers between my parents when they thought I wasn't listening. Secret meetings with doctors. Files disappearing whenever I entered a room. Something was being planned. Something big. Then one night, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was chained to a metal chair inside a medical room. Bright lights burned into my vision. Machines surrounded me. Doctors stood at screens full of data. And behind them stood my parents, watching silently. My father's voice came through the speakers. Initiate Protocol Genesis. Chapter 1 Part 3. Panic hit me instantly. Doctors moved forward with syringes filled with glowing liquid. "What is that?" I shouted. Nobody answered. One by one, the liquid entered my bloodstream. Then the pain started. It felt like fire spreading through my entire body. My heartbeat spiked. Vitals rising. Growth markers increasing. Something inside me was waking up. Not just strength. Something deeper. My muscles tightened and began to expand under my skin. The restraints around my wrists bent. Metal groaned under pressure. Chapter 1 Part 4. The transformation escalated. My body surged with power. 6'5", 6'8", 7 feet. The chair shattered as the restraints snapped apart. I dropped to my knees as my bones shifted and rebuilt themselves. The room suddenly felt smaller. The ceiling felt lower. The doctors backed away in fear. The monitors flashed red warnings everywhere. But my parents, they were smiling. "Continue the procedure," my father said calmly. Pain hit me again, stronger than before. My body kept growing past every limit they expected. Until the system froze. The machines couldn't measure me anymore. I stood in the middle of the room, massive and unstable. And for the first time, they were afraid of me. Chapter 2 The Sleeping Monster. The last thing I remembered was the terrified look on the doctors' faces. Then darkness consumed everything. His heart rate is stabilizing. That's impossible. How long has he been unconscious? 9 days. Silence filled the observation room. Behind the reinforced glass lay Kim Lee Suong, motionless, sleeping. The massive hospital bed had been custom built. After the original one collapsed beneath his weight during the first night, even unconscious, he looked terrifying. His broad chest rose and fell with slow, powerful breaths. Every inhale seemed to make the room feel heavier. Every exhale made the lights flicker. Nobody could explain it, not even the scientists responsible for Protocol Genesis. "What have we created?" one researcher whispered. No one answered, because everyone was thinking the same thing. Monster. Day 12. The first guard collapsed. He wasn't injured. There were no signs of poison. No wounds. Nothing. He simply fell to his knees while standing outside Kim's room. "I can't breathe." Those were the only words he managed before passing out. After that, nobody was allowed within 20 feet of the room for extended periods. The closer someone got to Kim, the heavier the pressure became. It felt as if an invisible weight was crushing down on them. Strong alphas began sweating. Betas grew nauseous. Even seasoned mafia enforcers refused to stand watch. Some quit altogether. Day 15. The phenomenon became impossible to ignore. Researchers called it an aura field, an invisible force surrounding Kim's body. The pressure wasn't physical. It was instinctual, primal, the kind of fear prey feels when facing an apex predator. One doctor lasted less than 30 seconds inside the room. By the time he staggered out, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. "He wasn't even awake," he whispered. "He wasn't even awake, and I felt like I was standing in front of death." Day 18. For the first time, even Kim's parents looked worried. The observation room had become a war room. Scientists argued non-stop. Graphs covered every monitor. No data made sense. Every scan showed the same result. Kim's body wasn't rejecting Genesis. It was adapting to it, perfectly, far too perfectly. One elderly researcher stared at the latest report. His face went pale. "We need to terminate the project." The room exploded into protests. Kim's father slammed his fist onto the table. "Absolutely not. You don't understand," the researcher said. His hands trembled as he pointed toward the sleeping giant beyond the glass. The protocol was designed to create the ultimate alpha. The room grew silent. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper, but every measurement suggests he surpassed that stage days ago. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For the first time since Genesis began, genuine fear appeared in Kim's father's eyes. Day 21. Kim dreamed. At least, that was what the monitors suggested. His brain activity suddenly spiked. The machines began screaming warnings. Red lights flashed throughout the facility. Researchers rushed into the observation room. What happened? Brain activity is increasing. His neural pathways are changing. He's waking up. Panic spread instantly. Guards scrambled for weapons. Scientists ran for the exits. Even Kim's parents stepped backward. The crushing aura that had haunted the facility for weeks suddenly intensified. Glass cracked. Computers shut down. Several people collapsed to their knees. A low growl echoed from the sleeping giant's chest. The entire room froze. Then, slowly, Kim's eyes opened, and every light in the room went out. Chapter 3. The Awakening Pressure. The monitors didn't just spike. They screamed. Red warnings flooded every screen in the facility. Neural activity surge. Unknown biological response. Subject aura field collapsing structural stability. Every scientist in the room froze. Because Kim Lee Suong had just opened his eyes. At first, nothing happened. He just lay there, silent, still, to still. Then the air changed. It wasn't visible at first, but everyone felt it. A crushing pressure rolled through the room, like a storm rolling into close to shore. One of the guards dropped his weapon instantly. "I can't," he choked out. His knees hit the floor. Kim's fingers twitched. The metal bedframe groaned under his weight. Even while lying down, he felt different, heavier, denser, like his body had become something the world wasn't designed to hold. He slowly turned his head. The movement alone made the lights flicker overhead. "His vitals are normal," a doctor whispered. "No," another replied shakily. "Nothing about him is normal." Kim sat up. The sound of the bed collapsing slightly echoed through the room. Not breaking, just failing to support him properly anymore. His shoulders rose higher than they should have. His frame no longer looked human in proportion. It looked reforged, refined into something heavier than muscle alone. His presence alone filled the room like gravity had increased. Then the transformation began, not loudly, not explosively, but inevitably. His muscles tightened beneath his skin, not swelling wildly like before, but compressing into dense, controlled mass. Every breath he took sounded deeper, stronger, like the air itself was struggling to enter his lungs. His height shifted again, slowly, painfully. The room's measuring systems flickered as they tried to calculate what they couldn't comprehend. 7'8". No, wait, 7'9". The system crashed. Every screen went black for half a second. When it rebooted, it stopped showing numbers entirely. Just error out of range. The scientists backed away instinctively. Even Kim's parents didn't move forward this time. For the first time, the mafia king who built empires through fear looked uncertain. Kim rose fully to his feet. The floor cracked beneath him, not from force, from existence, from weight the building wasn't designed to carry. And then the aura hit again, not like before, worse, much worse. It pressed down on everyone at once like an invisible hand gripping their lungs. A doctor collapsed instantly, unconscious. Another vomited and crawled toward the door. The guards abandoned their posts. Even the emergency systems began shutting down one by one. Kim looked around slowly. His voice came out lower than before, not louder, just heavier. "What did you do to me?" No one answered, because no one could stand close enough to speak. Behind the glass, alarms continued blaring, but none of it mattered anymore, because every person in that facility understood the same terrifying truth. Protocol Genesis hadn't created an alpha. It had created something that even alphas were never meant to survive near, and it was awake now. Chapter 4. The Alpha Form. The moment silence returned, it was worse than the alarms. Because the alarms were gone, everything electronic in the facility had shut down at once. No lights, no monitors, no backup systems, just darkness. And Kim stood in the center of the room, unmoving. The air around him felt compressed, like the building itself was being squeezed from the inside out. No one dared approach the glass anymore. Even his parents had stepped back, far back. Then his body shifted. Not like before, not growth, not pain, something deeper, something fundamental. His shoulders rolled slightly forward as if his bones were being ray-threaded. A low sound rumbled through his chest, too deep to be human, too structured to be instinct alone. The aura thickened instantly. Two guards collapsed before they even realized they were falling. "Phase 3 is activating," a scientist whispered. "That's not possible. We didn't authorize. He's doing it himself." Kim's hands clenched. The metal cuffs that were still somehow attached to his wrist snapped, apart without effort. Not bent, not strained, just broken, like they had forgotten what holding him meant. His spine arched slightly. A crack echoed through the room, not from injury, but from transformation. His shadow on the floor shifted first. It stretched, distorted, then split. Something behind him began to take shape. A massive outline, not fully physical yet, but present, like reality was struggling to define what he was becoming. His heartbeat slowed, then deepened, then stopped echoing like a human heart entirely. It became something else, something rhythmic, predatory. The first full change hit like a wave. His body expanded not in bulk alone, but in structure. Muscle density compressed and reinforced. Bone shifted under impossible pressure. His frame became wider, taller, heavier in ways that made the room feel smaller with every second. The air itself seemed to recoil. 7 foot, 10, 8 feet, no, it's still rising. The system finally gave up trying to measure him. Every screen displayed the same message. Subject outside biological parameters. Kim lifted his head slowly. His eyes were no longer just human. The pupils sharpened. The iris darkened. A faint glow flickered within them like embers under glass. He looked around the room once, and everyone felt it at the same time. They were prey, not metaphorically. Instinctively, the alpha form finally stabilized, but it didn't stop evolving. Behind him, the manifestation solidified completely. A towering spectral wolf-like silhouette formed from pressure, energy, and instinct itself. It didn't need shape, it enforced shape. Where it stood, gravity felt heavier. Where it looked, fear multiplied. One scientist finally screamed and ran. It didn't matter. He made it 3 steps before collapsing from the pressure alone. Kim took 1 step forward. The floor cracked instantly, not from impact, from dominance. Behind the glass, his father spoke quietly into the intercom. So it worked. No one responded, because everyone else was already trying to leave. Kim tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The alpha form behind him shifted too, synchronizing, reacting, alive. And then, the containment doors unlocked themselves. Not hacked, not broken, accepted. As if the facility itself understood something terrifying. There was no point holding him anymore. He didn't escape. He was simply no longer contained. The silence after the doors unlocked was not relief. It was permission, and that was worse. Kim didn't move at first. He just stood there, still human in outline, but no longer human in anything that mattered. The spectral wolf behind him lowered its head, not in rest, in recognition. Then the change resumed, but this time, it wasn't incremental. It was final. His body bent forward slightly as if pulled by gravity. That didn't belong to the room anymore. The air around him thickened until it looked almost visible, like pressure, had texture. A sound rippled out from his chest, low, continuous, absolute, not a growl, a command. The wolf-shaped manifestation behind him stepped forward, and instead of staying separate, it merged. Reality flickered. The outline of Kim blurred as something far larger began to override him, rather than simply surround him. Bones restructured again, this time not just reshaping, but expanding into a form that no longer matched human design at all. His shoulders widened until the restraints of the room felt like a joke that had gone too far. His height surged again, but now it wasn't being measured, it was being acknowledged. The system didn't even try to calculate anymore. It simply failed. The spectral wolf collapsed inward like a star folding into itself. Energy, instinct, and form all compressed into Kim at once, and when it finished, he wasn't standing inside it anymore. He was it. A massive alpha beast now filled the chamber. Not a transformation you could describe in clean biological terms. More like nature itself had been rewritten and told to take his shape. Massive limbs lowered slightly as the floor beneath him fractured in a widening circle. His presence alone pressed against the glass walls until they groaned in protest. Somewhere in the facility, emergency locks tried to engage. They didn't matter. They never had. Behind the glass, scientists were no longer speaking. They were just watching the readings spike into nonsense. Mass undefined. Force output nonlinear. Subject status beyond containment classification. The moment the system stopped fighting him, the pressure didn't vanish. It just stopped being forced outward. For a few seconds, the entire facility stayed trapped in that unbearable weight, like the air itself had learned fear and forgotten how to let it go. Then Kim exhaled again. This time, it wasn't domination, it was release. The change began in reverse, not violently, not painfully, like something massive deciding it no longer needed to occupy so much space. His towering form shuddered once, just once, and the overwhelming silhouette behind him began to dissolve. The spectral presence that had merged with him didn't disappear. It receded, back into him, like a tide returning to the sea. The facility immediately felt it. People dropped to their knees, gasping as oxygen suddenly remembered how to exist again. A few guards stumbled backward, pressing hands to their chests like they'd just been pulled out of deep water. The glass no longer groaned. The walls stopped shaking. Even the alarms long dead felt unnecessary now. Kim's body continued to shrink, but shrink wasn't the right word. It was refinement. Mass redistributed, density recalibrated, power compressed into something more controlled, more deliberate. His shoulders narrowed from that impossible breadth, though they were still far beyond human proportions. His spine settled from its arched dominance into a controlled, upright stance. His height dropped step by step until it stabilized at something terrifyingly specific. 7 feet, then a fraction more. 7'7". He stood there like that for a moment, still, watching, listening, not the way a confused subject would, the way something aware measures what remains after transformation. His eyes softened but only slightly. The ember-like glow dimmed, not extinguished, just contained, like a furnace being sealed behind reinforced glass instead of left open to the air. The instinctual pressure around him faded into something tolerable, not gone, just controlled. People could finally breathe without feeling like they were being measured by their own heartbeat. A scientist finally spoke, voice shaky. He's stabilizing. No one corrected him. No one dared. Kim looked down at his hands, flexed them once. The sound of joints adjusting echoed softly, not painful, just final. Like his body was confirming its new rules. Behind the glass, someone whispered without meaning to. That's not a subject anymore. Another voice followed, even quieter. That's an apex. The word hung there, not as praise, not as fear alone, but classification, a category the facility didn't have protocols for. Kim finally turned his head toward the observation side. Slowly, deliberately, everyone instinctively stepped back, even those who knew the containment was theoretically active again, because something in them understood. He wasn't at full power anymore, and he still didn't need it. The alpha presence was still there, but folded inward now like a sleeping giant choosing not to wake. Controlled, aware, watching the world instead of pressing against it. Kim spoke for the first time since the transformation began. His voice was lower than before, not monstrous, just heavy with depth that didn't belong to someone his age. I can hear everything now. A pause. His gaze shifted slightly, as if focusing on sounds no one else could detect. Even things that aren't speaking. No one responded. There was nothing useful to say. He took one step toward the glass, and stopped, not because he was restrained, but because he chose to. For the first time since it all began, the facility wasn't reacting to him. It was waiting on him, and whatever he decided next was no longer an experiment outcome. It was a direction the world would have to adjust to. The silence didn't last. It never did anymore, not around him. Kim stood in the center of the containment chamber for several seconds after speaking. The last remnants of his aura were still in the air, like heat after an explosion, but even that was fading now. Slowly, carefully, as if his body was learning how to not overwhelm the world. Then it stopped. The pressure finally broke. Not in a crash, in a release. Like a dam quietly opening instead of bursting. Every person in the room instinctively sucked in a full breath at the same time. Some even stumbling as their lungs remembered what normal oxygen felt like. A few dropped to the ground just because they could finally stand, without being crushed by invisible weight. Kim's posture shifted slightly. The towering dominance that had defined his alpha state didn't vanish, but it folded inward. His shoulders lowered a fraction. His breathing steadied. His presence became contained, still enormous by human standards, still wrong in scale, but no longer suffocating. 7'7", 16 years old, and now officially classified by systems that no longer fully understood him as an apex predator anomaly. His eyes flickered once, the ember-like glow dimmed further. Not gone, just buried, like something forced into rest after being awake far too long. A step, then another. He tried to move toward the exit, but halfway there, his body stopped listening cleanly. His hand pressed against the wall for support. For the first time since the transformation began, something in him wavered. Not power, not instinct. Fatigue, deep, cellular exhaustion, like every system in his body, had been pushed past its designed limit and was now collapsing into recovery all at once. One scientist noticed immediately. He's destabilizing. No, wait, he's crashing. Kim's knees hit the floor, not dramatically, not violently, just inevitability, like gravity finally collecting what it had been waiting for. His breathing slowed. His eyes stayed open for a moment longer, unfocused. Then they softened, and the last trace of the alpha pressure fully withdrew, into him sealed away rather than active. Before anyone could reach him, he passed out. The sound of his body hitting the floor didn't echo. The room was too careful now, too afraid of what sound might trigger next. No one moved for several seconds. Even the guards didn't approach immediately, because instinctively, everyone understood the same thing. He wasn't dangerous right now, but he also wasn't reachable. Outside the facility, things changed quickly after that. Too quickly. Reports were filed, classifications updated, entire protocols rewritten in real time, and the word Apex began appearing in places where subject used to be. Days later, in a secured high-rise facility overlooking Seoul, two voices spoke quietly in a private office. He's not waking up yet, his mother said, staring at the data feed. Doctors estimate 3 to 5 weeks minimum. His father didn't respond immediately. He just looked at the screen showing a still body too large for any standard hospital bed. The body is repairing itself, he said finally, not shutting down. A pause settled between them. Heavy, calculated. Then his mother spoke again, more carefully this time. The councils are already asking questions. His father exhaled slowly. Of course they are. Another screen lit up beside them. Diplomatic profiles, lineage records, alliance proposals. One name stayed highlighted longer than the rest. An Omega-born heir from a royal dynasty. Line, one of the few remaining bloodlines, still recognized in high-tier political structures. A proposed match. Not personal, strategic. If he stabilizes, his mother said quietly, they want integration, control through alliance structure. Her voice dropped. They think pairing him might keep him anchored. His father finally turned away from the screen. And if he doesn't stabilize? Silence. Outside, security footage replayed the same image on loop. Kim standing at 7'7", no longer collapsing the room with pressure, but still reshaping it just by existing. And then, falling, not defeated, just spent beyond human limits. In every monitored facility across the system, the same classification note had been added in red. Subject response feared by all known levels of staff. Recommendation: avoid direct stimulus until full recovery. And somewhere deep within that sleeping body, something still alive in him shifted faintly. Not awake, not conscious, just aware enough to remember. The world was still there, and it was waiting. The first thing that came back wasn't sound. It was awareness. Kim woke like something surfacing from the bottom of an ocean that didn't exist. There was no sharp inhale, no sudden movement, just a slow return, like consciousness had to find its way back through layers of weightless darkness. Then the room remembered him. The monitors spiked instantly. Every system in the facility that still functioned lit up at once, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Subject activity detected. Vitals unstable, no. Correcting vitals reforming. Alpha signature, online. Kim's fingers moved first. A slight curl, then a full flex. The bed beneath him creaked under his weight, even though it was reinforced for anomalies far smaller than him. His body felt different, not weaker, not stronger, refined again, like something inside him had been reorganizing itself while he slept. His eyes opened, and the room immediately changed temperature. Not physically, perceptually, the color had shifted. No longer the dark, ember-like tone from before. Now his irises carried a gold-green hue, like light filtered through something ancient and alive. Not glowing aggressively, but aware, calm in a way that felt more unsettling than intensity ever did. It wasn't just that he was looking at the world. It was that the world felt noticed. A breath escaped him, and the air answered. It started slowly, barely perceptible at first. A pressure returning to the room, not crushing like before, but present, like gravity remembering his existence. The aura had reactivated with him, not exploding outward this time, unfolding. The nearest technician stumbled back immediately. It's waking with him. Kim sat up. The movement was smooth, controlled, but the sheer mass of him made the entire reinforced frame groan softly in protest. 7'7", still unchanged in size, but somehow more complete in presence than before. Like the time asleep hadn't reduced him, it had settled him into something final. His head tilted slightly, as if he was listening again, but this time, there was no chaos in his expression, only recognition. Still here, he said quietly. His voice carried further than it should have. Not louder, just heavier in meaning. The aura around him tightened briefly, like a pulse, and every monitor in the room flickered. For a split second, the system misread him again, then corrected itself, then failed to correct itself properly. Subject classification aphesis error. Reclassification attempt failed. Status beyond category. Outside the chamber, alarms didn't activate. No one dared trigger them manually, because last time, alarms didn't matter. Kim swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floor beneath him cracked slightly on contact, even though it was built for reinforced load-bearing anomalies. He paused at the sensation, looked down, then exhaled softly, and the pressure eased again, like he was adjusting himself on purpose. One of the scientists spoke carefully through the intercom. "Kim, can you hear us?" A pause. Then his eyes shifted slightly toward the glass. Directly, instantly, like there had never been any distance at all. "I can hear everything," he said again. A faint pause. "It's quieter now." No one responded, because no one understood what that meant yet. He stood fully, and for a moment, the facility braced instinctively. But nothing attacked, nothing collapsed, nothing broke. Instead, his aura settled into a controlled field around him, still immense, still unnatural, but no longer suffocating, like a storm held inside a glass sky. He took one step forward, then another, each movement deliberate, as if he was relearning how to exist inside his own body. Behind the reinforced glass, every observer instinctively stepped back again anyway, not because he was overwhelming them, but because they remembered what he could be. Kim stopped at the center of the chamber and looked up slightly, as if sensing something far beyond the facility, beyond the city, beyond the systems watching him, and quietly, almost to himself, he said, "I didn't dream." A pause. "I was just waiting." The monitors spiked again, but this time, nobody rushed to interpret them, because the only thing they were certain of now was that the apex had opened his eyes again, and whatever came next would no longer be a reaction. Several cities away, the world did not feel quiet. It shifted. In a high-rise that overlooked a completely different stretch of night-lit skyline, something ancient paused mid-motion. He had no name that mattered anymore, only titles people used when they were trying not to say what he really was. A vampire enigma, old enough that cities blurred together as passing lights, powerful enough that distance meant very little. He was standing near an open window when it hit. Not sound, not sight, not even magic in the way most systems would define it. It was pressure, a sudden distortion in the fabric of awareness itself, like the world had briefly inhaled somewhere far away and forgotten to exhale correctly. His glass of dark liquid stopped halfway to his lips. He didn't move for a full second, then another. Slowly, his eyes shifted toward the direction of the disturbance, far beyond buildings, beyond borders, beyond what normal perception was meant to track. "That wasn't there before," he murmured. His voice was calm, but the stillness in it was new. Interest, not boredom. The sensation rolled again, not stronger, not weaker, just present enough to be impossible to ignore. A pressure signature that didn't behave like energy, or aura, or any known classification. It behaved like something that understood it was being perceived. The vampire Enigma exhaled slowly and set the glass down. For the first time in a long while, he turned away from everything else he had been doing, not because he was alarmed, because something had finally matched his attention. Apprentice, experiment. No, he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a distant heartbeat that wasn't sound-based at all. The sensation pulsed again, faint, controlled, but undeniably alive. His eyes narrowed. Gold-green resonance signatures were rare in the world he knew. But this wasn't just color. This was structure, something layered, something that had recently awakened, and was still learning how much space it occupied. An apex, he said quietly, testing the word like it had weight. A faint smile formed, not warm, not cruel, curious. Several cities away, the disturbance in the atmosphere stabilized again, as if the source had adjusted its own existence on purpose. That only made things worse, because control implied awareness, and awareness implied choice. The vampire Enigma finally stepped back from the window fully. The city lights behind him no longer mattered. Something else had entered the map, something that didn't belong to any existing hierarchy. If it's awake, he murmured, almost to himself, then it will notice being watched eventually. A pause. His gaze sharpened slightly. And if it notices me back. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned toward the interior of the room, where older records, sealed archives, and forgotten classifications waited. Cases that hadn't been opened in decades. Warnings that had been ignored, because nothing had ever triggered them twice. Now something had. Far away again, in the facility where Kim had just opened his eyes, the aura pulsed once more steady, controlled, but undeniably expanding its awareness outward in subtle waves. Not searching, just existing strongly enough that the world couldn't pretend it wasn't there. And in that quiet exchange across impossible distance, two things became true at once. One apex had awakened, and something ancient had just decided it wanted to know exactly what kind. The next time the facility doors opened for Kim, it wasn't for containment, it was for presentation. He didn't walk in alone. He never really did anymore. Even when no one physically followed him, the air around him still carried that same controlled weight, like reality itself had learned to stay slightly more careful in his presence. 7'7", 16 years old. Chapter: The Arranged Binding. The room was already wrong before Kim even entered it. Not because of noise, because of silence that behaved. People didn't speak unless they had to. They didn't move unless necessary. Even the air felt staged, like the entire facility had been redesigned to accommodate something it didn't understand. Kim stepped through the doorway, 7'7", 16 years old, and immediately, the atmosphere collapsed inward around him. Not physically, instinctively. His scent followed a fraction of a second later, and everything in the room reacted. It wasn't a smell in the normal sense. It was authority made sensory. Heavy, deep, layered, like standing too close to a storm that had decided not to move yet. People's posture changed without permission. A few guards stiffened immediately. One looked down without realizing it. Another swallowed hard, hand tightening on a weapon they suddenly weren't sure they were allowed to use. The Omega was already in the room. Small, pale, just under 5'4". They were standing perfectly still near the center line, surrounded by officials, who were doing their best to look like they were still in control of the situation. They weren't. The moment Kim's scent reached them directly, they flinched, not dramatically, not outwardly, but their breathing changed. Their shoulders tightened, their instincts reacted before their mind could correct them. Because the scent didn't invite anything, it commanded response, not affection, not curiosity, obedience. The Omega lowered their gaze almost immediately, not because they were weak, but because looking at him directly felt like standing too close to something that could erase distance without moving. Kim noticed, and didn't care. His eyes moved briefly across the room, cold, measuring, uninterested in everything except structure. His parents stood near the officials, waiting, careful. A council representative stepped forward cautiously. This is a formal stabilization arrangement, a binding proposal between Royal Omega lineage and Apex class anomaly. Kim didn't react at first. Then he spoke. His voice was low, heavy, completely controlled. I didn't choose this. The words didn't rise. They pressed down. Even the lights in the room seemed to flicker slightly under the weight of his tone. The Omega visibly tightened at the sound of his voice, not because of emotion, because of instinct. Their hands curled slightly at their sides, like their body was trying to stay composed under pressure it couldn't interpret. Kim's scent intensified for a moment, not aggressively, not intentionally, just naturally leaking dominance into the space, like gravity asserting itself. The effect was immediate. One guard stepped back without meaning to. Another steadied themselves against the wall. A technician whispered, "It's not fluctuating. It's establishing range control." Kim looked at the Omega for the first time. Really looked. Not curiosity, not recognition, just assessment. Like evaluating something that had been placed in his space without consent. The Omega didn't meet his eyes. They couldn't hold it. Not because of fear alone, but because his presence made sustained attention feel physically difficult. Like the body wanted to yield before thought finished forming. Kim exhaled slowly. The scent pressure shifted slightly with it. The room immediately loosened a fraction, as if the atmosphere had been given permission to breathe again, but only barely. Remove the arrangement, he said flatly. No anger, no hesitation, just conclusion. A council member stiffened. That is not an option under dynastic stabilization law. Kim's gaze flicked toward them, and the man stopped speaking mid-sentence, not because he was interrupted, because continuing suddenly felt unnecessary. The Omega shifted slightly again, still not looking up. Their posture was controlled, but their instincts were clearly overwhelmed by proximity. Every breath they took felt like it had to be carefully measured, around something larger than them. Kim turned his attention away from them entirely after that. Dismissal, not engagement. The Omega wasn't a partner, wasn't a threat, wasn't even an interest, just a variable being placed too close to something it couldn't affect. Behind the reinforced observation glass, a deeper voice spoke quietly. The vampire Enigma, watching from secured distance. That scent is not just dominance, he murmured. It's suppression of hierarchy itself. A pause. Everything in that room is reacting to him like instinct is no longer optional. Back in the chamber, Kim took a single step forward. The floor didn't crack this time, but the atmosphere adjusted around him anyway, like reality itself had learned how to behave when he was calm. And still, he didn't look at the Omega again. Not once. Because in his mind, there was no bond forming here, no connection, no inevitability, only containment, only structure being forced into proximity with something it didn't understand. And far away beyond this room, beyond the city, something ancient watched the pattern forming, and began to pay closer attention than it had intended. Kim's private chamber was built like a luxury cage, everything reinforced, everything oversized by human standards. And still, it wasn't enough. The bed sat in the center of the room like an offering that had already failed. Massive frame, layered support structure, adaptive suspension meant for enhanced class anomalies. Kim stood beside it and didn't even sit at first, because even looking at it made the mismatch obvious. 7'7", 16 years old, and still too large for anything designed to call itself standard accommodation. He exhaled slowly and moved through the room. Kim didn't notice it immediately. Not at first. There were already too many changes happening inside his body to treat any single one as unusual anymore. The room was still too small, the bed still too fragile, the door still too low, and his presence still too large for anything designed around human limits. His private chamber was built like a luxury cage, everything reinforced, everything oversized by human standards. And still, it wasn't enough. The bed sat in the center of the room like an offering that had already failed. Massive frame, layered support structure, adaptive suspension meant for enhanced class anomalies. Kim stood beside it for a moment without sitting, because even looking at it made the mismatch obvious. 7'7", 16 years old, and still too large for anything designed to call itself standard accommodation. He exhaled slowly and moved through the room. Every doorway required a slight duck of his head now. Not exaggerated, just enough to remind him that architecture had not been built with his existence in mind. The ceiling didn't feel low. His body just felt wrongly scaled for the world. He sat on the edge of the bed. The entire frame shifted under him with a soft mechanical complaint. Not failure, but strain, like the furniture was politely admitting defeat. Still too small, he muttered. Not frustration, observation. Silence followed, the kind that only existed around him, now carefully maintained. Like even sound didn't want to trigger anything unpredictable. Then it started. A sensation deep in his structure. Familiar now. Too familiar. Not pain, not warning, just change. Kim's fingers tightened slightly against the mattress. His focus sharpened inward. Again, he said under his breath. The first sound was internal. A slow, precise creak running through his skeletal frame like recalibration, forced through living architecture. His spine adjusted upward. His shoulders followed. His frame extended with unsettling smoothness, like something inside him had decided the previous version was incomplete. 2 inches. Clean. Exact. Final. The bed beneath him felt even smaller now, as if the world itself was shrinking around him, instead of his body expanding. He exhaled once. The air thickened briefly in response, then settled, and then, his body shifted again. A pressure formed at the base of his spine, different from before, lower, deeper, fundamental. Kim stopped completely. Again, he muttered, quieter this time. This wasn't bone length. This was structure. Completion. Something extended outward from him with slow inevitability, as if it had always existed and was only now deciding to be seen. A tail emerged. Not decorative, not symbolic, functional, heavy with controlled density, moving instinctively, as it met gravity for the first time, and immediately understood it. It adjusted behind him with perfect balance, reacting to his smallest movements like it had always belonged there. Kim didn't look back at it right away. He just sat still, processing, measuring, accepting. Of course, he said quietly. No emotion, just inevitability. The aura around him responded, not expanding, not collapsing, but integrating. Like every new change wasn't breaking him, it was completing him. Far beyond the facility, beyond monitored airspace and sealed classifications, something watched. Aurelion Vale. He stood in a dim, distant chamber where the world outside felt irrelevant. His gaze was fixed on Kim as though distance didn't exist. A faint smile touched his expression. Not hunger, not obsession. Interest sharpened into focus. A tail structure, he murmured softly. So the baseline anatomy is still unfinished. A pause. Then, quieter, interesting. Back in the chamber, Kim finally glanced over his shoulder. The tail moved slightly with the motion responsive. Natural, unsettling in how correct it felt. He frowned faintly, not discomfort. Calculation. I didn't authorize that, he said quietly. No one answered. No system had permission to. Outside his chamber, the world continued adjusting itself around him. Not chaos, not collapse. Reclassification, council protocols rewriting in real time. Military observation units rebranded as protective oversight. Entire hierarchies reorganizing around a single truth. He could not be contained, only accommodated. Kim turned forward again. The tail followed smoothly. Still new, still unfamiliar, but already learning him. This is getting excessive, he said under his breath. But he didn't stop it, because stopping it implied control over something that was no longer asking permission. His aura steadied again, controlled, layered, deeper than before, not spreading, not collapsing, just existing at a level the world now had to negotiate with. And somewhere far away, Aurelion Vale's gaze lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Not claiming, not interfering, just watching something that, for the first time in a very long time, might actually be worth following. Time skip, age 19, the apex consolidation. 3 years changed nothing about the fact that Kim didn't fit anywhere. Not buildings, not systems, not classifications, but the world around him had learned, reluctantly, and then completely. At 19, Kim was no longer a subject under observation. He was the center of an entire hidden infrastructure his parents had once controlled, reorganized around him. What used to be called restricted operations no longer functioned without his approval, not because he demanded control, but because every system that once tried to regulate him eventually reached the same conclusion. He was the regulating force. Seoul's public government still existed, but beneath it, in the sealed administrative layer no citizen ever saw, a second structure had formed: containment, logistics, anomaly response coordination, apex class stabilization oversight, all of it quietly centered under one authority, Kim. And the strangest part, he didn't rule it like a king, he didn't command it like a tyrant, he simply existed at the level where decisions stopped being debated and started being adjusted around him. He stood in a reinforced command chamber deep below the city of Seoul, the architecture redesigned repeatedly over the years just to accommodate his height and movement. Even now, doorframes had been widened twice, ceilings raised 3 times, furniture abandoned entirely in favor of adaptive platforms. He had grown again over time, not in sudden bursts anymore, but in slow, inevitable increments that the medical systems now called post-stabilization, evolution. And every time it happened, the system simply recalibrated around him. Kim exhaled softly, standing at the center of the chamber while reports streamed across floating displays. Apex activity across regions. Containment breaches avoided before they happened. Unclassified entities responding to his presence from impossible distances. One name still appeared in remote monitoring logs more than any other: Aurelion Vale. The vampire Enigma had never made contact. Not directly, but his attention had become consistent enough that entire surveillance branches were dedicated to tracking where his interest shifted next. Kim noticed it now. He always did. Even without direct communication, the presence was measurable, not intrusive, just persistent, like something that had decided he was part of its long-term observation field. Still watching, Kim said quietly, his voice, deeper now than at 19, carried easily through the chamber. Not impressed, not threatened, just aware. A technician nearby hesitated before speaking. His activity patterns are increasing again, sir. Aurelion Vale has moved closer to Korean airspace boundaries. Kim didn't turn. Let him. No emotion in it. Only certainty that distance meant nothing anymore. Not between systems like theirs. Far above ground, beyond the city skyline. Aurelion Vale stood in silence again, watching the exact same data streams. The exact same anomaly signature. And this time, his expression wasn't just interest. It was recognition of something approaching inevitability. He stopped growing unstable, Aurelion murmured, and started growing intentional. A pause, then a faint smile. That's new. Back below the city, Kim turned slightly as another report appeared. Apex classification finalization. Global acknowledgement threshold crossed. The system had a new label for him now. Not subject, not anomaly, not asset. Anchor Apex class entity. Kim looked at it for a moment, then dismissed it, like it didn't matter what they called him anymore, because whatever he was becoming was no longer waiting for permission to exist. Chaptered stabilization contract. At 20, Kim stopped being something people managed and became something they built systems around. The chamber he stood in now was no longer experimental. It was administrative. Reinforced not for containment but for expectation. Because at this point, everyone had accepted the same truth. He was not going to fit into the world. The world would adjust around him instead. The second arranged binding was introduced during a council briefing that lasted less than 12 minutes. No debate, just presentation. A strategic alliance between his families remaining, controlled operations, and a stabilized, external lineage that specialized in diplomatic containment support. The Omega candidate stood beside the dossier projection, just under 5'7", composed posture, carefully trained. Kim looked at them once. Not longer than that. I accept, he said. A pause. Then, flatly, there will be no emotional obligation. No one in the room argued, not because they agreed, because his tone made argument feel irrelevant. The Omega nodded slowly, not submissive, careful, like someone understanding a storm had agreed to remain in one place. And that alone was the best outcome available. The first meeting happened 3 days later. Kim arrived late, not intentionally. He simply didn't measure time the same way anymore. When he entered the chamber, the atmosphere changed immediately. Not violently, but physically. Air pressure increased slightly around him, not enough to harm, but enough to make proximity feel heavy. Like standing too close to an elevated gravity field. Systems registered it instantly. Localized aura density increase. Biological discomfort range 10-15 feet. The Omega stood already inside the space. In the moment Kim entered fully, they visibly steadied themselves. Not collapsing, not reacting uncontrollably, but instinctively adjusting posture, as if their body recognized something far larger nearby. Kim noticed, and immediately controlled it. His breath slowed, his aura tightened inward. The pressure in the room eased slightly, still present, but no longer expanding outward uncontrollably. Keep distance, he said calmly. Not cruelty, precision. The Omega hesitated, then stopped advancing. Kim's gaze didn't linger. He wasn't evaluating them emotionally. He was measuring stability conditions, like checking whether a system remained functional under environmental load. The Omega spoke carefully. I understand the arrangement. I won't interfere with your operations. Kim gave a slight nod. That is sufficient. No warmth, no rejection, just definition of boundaries. Still, every time the Omega came closer than necessary, the room reacted. Not through force, through pressure fields forming naturally around Kim's aura stability range. The environment itself became denser within a radius of him, like reality tightening its rules near an apex class entity. And the Omega learned quickly, not fear of him, but respect for the space he unintentionally controlled. Far above the facility network, in an observation layer that no public system acknowledged, Aurelion Vale watched the interaction unfold through encrypted sensory projections. He leaned slightly forward, interest sharpening again, not at dominance, at restraint, so he can regulate it, Aurelion murmured. A faint pause. That's the first real sign of long-term compatibility with surroundings. His gaze lingered longer than usual on Kim, not on the Omega, on Kim's control pattern. The way his aura compressed instead of spreading. The way pressure became structured instead of chaotic. He's learning to hold himself back, Aurelion said softly. Then, almost amused, that might be more dangerous than the unrestrained version. Below, Kim turned slightly as the meeting ended. The Omega remained at a careful distance, neither approaching nor retreating further. A stable boundary established. Not emotional, not intimate, just functional coexistence. Kim exhaled once. The pressure in the room settled fully again. Controlled, contained, intentional. And as he walked out, he didn't look back, but somewhere far beyond him, someone was, and for the first time, it wasn't just watching power, it was watching discipline forming inside it. Chapter Containment Failure Event. The chamber was already unstable before anyone crossed the threshold. Kim felt it immediately, not emotionally, structurally. His aura wasn't fully under command anymore. It was holding barely, like a system, running beyond design limits, while still refusing to shut down. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Every movement required more control than it should have. Stay outside the radius, he said. Low, sharp, final. The Omega didn't stop, not because they didn't hear him, but because they didn't process the severity correctly fast enough. I need to verify your stability readings, they insisted, stepping further in. If this continues, you'll spike again. And Kim's head lowered slightly, not toward them, away from them, like the act of focusing outward was costing him control. You're going to trigger it, he said quietly. Another step, too close, still within the unstable field. That was the mistake. The air broke before anything else did, not physically, but perceptually, like pressure in the room suddenly stopped obeying containment rules. Kim dropped to one knee, not collapsing, forcing himself down, one hand hitting the floor to stabilize his frame as the system inside him surged violently. One hand pressed against the floor as his internal structure fought for equilibrium. Warning: apex control deviation, stability index falling. The Omega froze, finally realizing the severity. Kim, his head lifted slightly, eyes beginning to shift, gold forming at the edges of his iris. Get back, he said, strained, controlled, barely holding. But the Omega was still inside partial range, still too close to the unstable field boundary. And that was enough. The aura snapped outward, not explosively, structurally, like reality tightening to fast around a collapsing system. Kim's eyes fully turned gold. The chamber lights flickered violently, containment systems activated and immediately failed to stabilize output. His body reacted, not violently but adaptively, forced recalibration under pressure overload. 7-8, 7-9, 7-10. Growth not as transformation, but as compensation, his structure expanding to hold internal pressure that exceeded previous limits. The Omega stepped back fully now, clearing the danger radius as alarms finally triggered properly. Kim remained on one knee, aura locked in unstable equilibrium. Not broken, not stable, held. I told you, he said quietly through strained breath, not to enter the range. Silence followed, the chamber stabilized by fractions, enough to prevent collapse, not enough to reset. Far above, in an observation layer that existed outside official mapping systems, Aurelion Vale watched everything unfold without interruption. For once, no amusement, only focused attention, growth triggered by proximity breach under instability state. He murmured, that's not standard apex evolution. A pause. That's adaptive survival restructuring. His gaze sharpened slightly as Kim slowly forced himself back toward control. Still kneeling, still glowing faint gold. He's not losing control, Aurelion said quietly. He's rewriting the threshold of it, and for the first time, his interest stopped being passive observation and started becoming pursuit. Chapter of the chamber built for an apex. By the time Kim was hospitalized again, no one called it a hospital anymore. There wasn't a word for it that didn't sound wrong. Containment wing, medical annex, apex recovery facility, all of them failed the same way language always did around him. The transport didn't go through roads. It went through reinforced sublevels carved beneath Seoul. Routes originally designed for disaster class. Evacuations that had never been meant to be used like this. Even those corridors felt too small. Not because they were. Because he was too large for the idea of normal space to apply anymore. At 710 in his stabilized state, Kim didn't fit into standard medical architecture at all. Not beds, not doors, not diagnostic frames, not restraint systems. Everything they tried had already failed in earlier incidents. So this time, they didn't build a setup for a patient. They built one for a phenomenon. The chamber was assembled over 3 days. Not constructed, assembled, like machinery being configured around an immovable object. The bed wasn't a bed anymore. It was a suspended platform anchored into the floor with hydraulic stabilizers, designed to adjust dynamically with mass shifts that didn't follow predictable biological limits. The frame was wide enough to feel empty even when he lay across it. The height adjustable not in inches but in structural layers. The ceiling panels had been removed entirely in one section and replaced with a vertical expansion dome, allowing clearance for his height without forcing him to bend or compress his posture. Because the last time they tried to make him fit, the entire frame cracked under his aura pressure alone. Doors were no longer doors. They were retractable compression fields. Walls that shifted aside instead of swinging open. Even the soundproofing had been doubled, not for noise, but for presence bleed. Kim stood at the center of it all while technicians finished the last calibrations. He didn't look impressed. He didn't look annoyed. Just aware that once again, the world had rearranged itself instead of asking him to change. Still inefficient, he said quietly. His voice carried easily through the chamber anyway. A technician swallowed hard. We couldn't scale it further without risking structural collapse under your aura density. Kim didn't respond, because that answer was already predictable. The aura around him was calmer now than before. Controlled, but never absent. Like gravity that had learned restraint but not silence. And then, the chamber lights shifted. Not alarms, not emergency signals. A controlled arrival sequence. Someone was entering. Kim turned his head slightly, not reacting emotionally, just registering a new variable in the room. The air changed first. Not pressure this time. Pattern disruption. Like something else entering the field that did not immediately submit to it. And then he saw him. Aurelion Vale. He didn't arrive like security personnel. He didn't arrive like a council observer. He arrived like something that had always been allowed to exist anywhere it wanted. Still, measured, calm, his presence did not collapse under Kim's aura. It passed through it like it was a different layer of reality entirely. Kim's eyes narrowed slightly. Not hostility. Recognition of anomaly. You're not registered in any facility records, Kim said. Aurelion Vale stopped at a respectful distance far outside the primary pressure radius. Not because he was forced, but because he chose it. I wouldn't be, Aurelion replied quietly. His voice carried an older weight to it, not louder, just certain. The room systems flickered for a fraction of a second trying to classify him, then failed. Kim tilted his head slightly. His aura reacted on instinct, tightening just a fraction. Not aggressive, curious. Aurelion's gaze shifted briefly over the chamber setup, over the custom architecture, the suspended platform, the reinforced expansion dome, the emergency recalibration systems embedded into every surface. They keep rebuilding the world around you, he said. A faint pause. And you keep outgrowing what they imagine. Kim didn't respond immediately, because for the first time in a while, someone wasn't reacting to him like a problem, or a weapon, or a threat. They were reacting like he was a constant. Who are you? Kim asked finally. Aurelion Vale's expression didn't change much, but something in his attention sharpened. Not surprise. Interest finally aligning with confirmation. I'm the thing they don't put in their reports, he said simply. Then, after a pause, Aurelion Vale, the name meant nothing in the system, which meant everything. Kim's aura shifted subtly again, not expanding, not collapsing, just acknowledging something that didn't behave like anything else he had encountered. You're watching me, Kim said. Aurelion didn't deny it. I have been. A pause, then softer. Not because you were unstable. He stepped slightly closer, but still outside the pressure boundary. Not testing it, understanding it. Because you were unfinished. Silence filled the chamber, not uncomfortable, just dense with implication. Kim studied him for a long moment. No emotional shift, no softening, just assessment. I don't like being observed, he said. Aurelion's faint smile returned. I didn't ask permission. That should have triggered something. A warning response, an instinctive escalation. But instead, Kim exhaled slowly, and the aura settled slightly. Not because he was disarmed, because Aurelion didn't behave like something that needed correction. For the first time since his escalation years ago, someone stood in his presence without immediately becoming part of his containment equation, and that fact alone was more disruptive than any aura spike. Aurelion Vale tilted his head slightly. You've grown again, he said quietly, almost amused. Not just in size. Kim didn't answer, but the room felt it anyway. He had noticed too, and somewhere in the space between controlled silence and measured curiosity, something new began to form. Not bond, not conflict, something closer to recognition, between two anomalies that didn't belong in the same classification system. And for the first time in years, Kim wasn't the only thing in the room that made reality adjust itself slightly just by existing. The name Aurelion Vale was not unknown. It was archived, catalogued, feared in systems that did not admit fear existed. He was not a rumor. He was a geopolitical constant, an empire-level anomaly sovereign, who controlled territories that no council openly acknowledged. And more importantly, he was documented at A2. When Kim was brought into the high-security containment chamber again, that fact alone changed the atmosphere. Not because of politics, because of scale. Kim stood still when the briefing file updated across the central display. 8-2, that's taller than me, he said quietly. Not emotional, just factual. It was the first time in years anything in the system had exceeded his physical classification, even slightly, and that alone was enough to register as a deviation. The chamber doors opened, and Aurelion Vale entered. There was no dramatic arrival, no announcement, just presence, structured, controlled, absolute. At A2, he didn't need to dominate space. He simply occupied it correctly, like the world had been partially designed with him in mind. Kim's gaze lifted slightly. For the first time in a long time, he had to look up, not far, but enough. Aurelion Vale stopped at a measured distance outside the primary containment field, not because of fear, because anything closer would have been unnecessary. Kim's aura reacted instantly, not aggressively, but recognitively, like the system inside him didn't immediately understand what it was facing. Aurelion's presence carried a structured signature that didn't behave like anything Kim had encountered. Not pressure in the usual sense, not force, more like calibrated authority existing without effort. So you're real, Kim said quietly. Aurelion's expression didn't change much. It would be inefficient to be otherwise. Silence followed, heavy, but not hostile. Then, Kim felt it. A resonance shift, not external attack. Internal response. His system reacting to proximity of a matching Apex class field. His aura flickered sharply. Containment systems immediately spiked warnings. Resonance overload risk. Apex field interaction detected. Kim exhaled once. Controlled. Intentional. Trying to stabilize the reaction. But his body was already attempting recalibration. Not chaos. Adaptation pressure. Like encountering a new upper bound and trying to rewrite itself to match it. Stop, Kim muttered under his breath. He tightened internal control. Aura compression increasing rapidly, forcing the system inward. The chamber lights flickered, not from instability, from overcorrection. Kim's knees dipped slightly, not collapsing fully, but the strain was visible now. Aurelion watched him carefully, not intervening, just observing the threshold response. You're resisting it, Aurelion said softly. Kim didn't respond. His focus was entirely internal, because his system was trying to expand again, not violently, naturally, as if proximity to another Apex class entity had triggered an evolution impulse. Kim forced it down harder, too hard. The aura snapped inward. Stabilization failure threshold crossed. Kim's vision dimmed. Not immediate collapse. Forced stabilization shut down. No, he said quietly. Then his body gave out. Not falling. Transitioning into coma-level stabilization. He was lowered onto the platform as systems immediately sealed the chamber. Into recovery mode, Aurelion stepped half a pace closer, not entering the field, just observing. So that's the limit, he murmured. The chamber shifted into full containment recovery protocol. Inside the coma state, Kim's body recalibrated. Not breaking, not destabilizing, restructuring. Height adjustment initiated. Bone density redistribution. System convergence alignment. 8081. Then it stabilized. No further escalation. No collapse. Just a new baseline locked into place. And then, a final adjustment. Deep within the stabilized system, his musculature refined itself. Not inflating, not exaggerating, reorganizing. Fiber structure thickened into layered density, aligning perfectly with the expanded skeletal frame. Muscle groups tightened and reinforced, settling into a denser, more efficient configuration built for the new scale rather than the old limits. Only after that final correction did the system fully stabilize. Outside, Aurelion Vale watched the final readouts appear. A faint pause, then a subtle smile. He met an upper bound, he said quietly, and survived it. He turned slightly away from the chamber, not leaving, not ending observation, just shifting focus forward, because now he understood something important. Kim was not just evolving, he was negotiating with limits, and Aurelion Vale had just become one of them. Interlude, the quiet surge. Kim did not wake, but his system did not stay still. Inside the stabilized coma chamber, all external vitals remained locked in controlled parameters. Heart rate steady, muscle state stabilized, height fixed at 8.1, containment systems green across every panel. And yet, the atmosphere inside the chamber began to change again. Not violently, not visibly. The aura field around him deepened, not expanding outward like before, but condensing inward, then radiating in slow, structured pulses like something inside him was cycling through a deeper layer of recalibration. The system flagged it immediately. Secondary aura phase detected. Non-critical surge cycle. Caused unknown internal restructuring. It was not a breakdown. It was not instability. It was something closer to an internal evolution loop, like the body was continuing to refine itself even in forced rest state. Outside the chamber, most observers only registered it as background fluctuation. Most, not all. Aurelion Vale did not look away. He stood at the far edge of the observation boundary, where even his presence was only partially allowed to interface with the containment field. Still, unmoving, focused. That pattern again, he murmured. His gaze narrowed slightly. The aura signature inside the chamber had changed. Not stronger in raw output, but deeper in structure, more layered, less human with every cycle. It did something unusual to perception itself. Not attraction, not emotion, but attention lock, like the mind was being forced to acknowledge it as a constant point in space-time that could not be ignored. Aurelion exhaled slowly. Even in rest, he said quietly, "You don't stop advancing." Inside the chamber, Kim's aura pulsed again. Slow, controlled, almost rhythmic, as if something in his system was completing cycles that did not require consciousness to continue. For a moment, even the containment field struggled to distinguish whether this was recovery or continuation. Aurelion stepped half a pace closer to the boundary, not crossing it, just acknowledging the pull of the pattern. "This isn't instability anymore," he said softly. "It's persistence." And in the sealed chamber, the apex remained asleep, while something inside him kept evolving anyway. Suppressant's apex containment protocol. Kim wasn't stable because the world was strong enough to hold him. He was stable because the world was constantly trying to dampen him down. After the first major escalation incident, the council stopped calling it treatment. They renamed it something safer, Aura Suppression Protocol. In reality, it was containment in liquid form, a regulated system of neural dampeners and biofield inhibitors, designed to reduce output from apex-class anomalies before their aura could naturally expand beyond safe environmental limits. For Kim, it was not optional. It was constant. Every stabilized state he entered awake or in recovery was supported by a layered suppression system. Neural inhibitor patches along circulation points, subdermal dampening micro-injectors, environmental field regulators embedded into every chamber, continuous calibration feedback loops tied directly to containment AI. It didn't remove his aura. It compressed it, like holding back a storm behind reinforced glass and pretending that meant the storm was gone. At 8.1, Kim's baseline presence was already beyond human tolerance thresholds. Without suppression, even stillness would distort surrounding air pressure. With suppression, he could function, barely, but there was a cost. There always was. The suppressants didn't understand growth compliance. They only understood reduction. So whenever Kim's internal system attempted recalibration, whether from proximity to other apex entities or from his own unresolved evolution cycles, the suppressants fought back hard, which meant every time his body tried to stabilize upward naturally, it met resistance. And when resistance failed, it didn't stop him, it delayed him. That delay was what caused the comas. The system didn't like uncontrolled transitions, so it forced shutdown states whenever suppression and evolution collided too violently. Kim called it something else. Interruption. The scientists called it survival, and Aurelion Vale called it interesting, because when Kim entered suppressed states, something unusual happened. His aura didn't disappear. It refined, compressed tighter, darker, more structured, like pressure building in a sealed core instead of dissipating. Which meant one thing: the suppressants weren't weakening him. They were shaping what kind of apex he became when they finally failed. And they would fail. They always did. Aurelion Vale observed this pattern during every encounter. The dampening layers, the micro fluctuations, the forced stabilization feedback loops. They're trying to keep a sovereign entity at baseline, he said once. A faint pause. That never works long term, because suppression didn't remove evolution. It delayed it. And in Kim's case, delay always came due in full. The suppressants were never meant to fail. That was the lie the system told itself to stay functional. Kim's body had been under continuous regulation for years now, not because he was unstable, but because stability at his scale was indistinguishable from disaster. Every cycle of medication was precise. Apex dampening injectors calibrated to his neural rhythm. Biofield inhibitors synchronized to his heartbeat variance. Atmospheric compression stabilizers embedded in every chamber he occupied. A constant correction loop, not healing, control, and still, he kept rising past it. At 8-1, Kim was already beyond any standard biological threshold the suppressants were designed for. The system didn't reduce him. It delayed him, held him in place just long enough for the world to breathe. But the cost was becoming measurable, even to him. Kim stood in the containment chamber, one hand resting lightly against the wall as diagnostic data streamed across the air in front of him. His aura was quiet today, compressed, pressed inward like a storm forced into a sealed core. Suppression status active. Field output stabilized artificially. Recalibration pressure increasing. Still not enough, he muttered. A technician hesitated at the edge of the room. We can increase the dosage again. But, no, Kim cut in immediately. Not loud, but final. The technician stopped speaking, because everyone in the facility understood the same thing now. Increasing suppression didn't make him safer. It made his system push harder against the boundary. And boundaries around Kim never stayed intact for long. Far above the containment levels, in a monitoring sector that technically didn't exist on any public registry. Aurelion Vale watched. He didn't observe like a scientist. He didn't analyze like a counsel. He watched like something that had already decided. Kim was significant and was simply waiting for proof of how significant. The data stream scrolled across his interface. Suppression cycles, aura compression graphs, stabilization failure probabilities. Aurelion's gaze lingered on one pattern longer than the rest. They're holding him down on purpose, he said quietly. There was no judgment in his tone, only recognition, and he's still adapting through it. That was the part that stayed with him, not the scale, not the power, not even the anomaly classification. The persistence. Aurelion leaned slightly forward in his observation seat. His empire had seen sovereign class entities before, had contained them, studied them, removed them. None of them behaved like this. None of them improved inside restraint. He's learning from suppression, Aurelion murmured. A pause. That's not supposed to happen. Below, Kim exhaled slowly. The suppressants tightened again in response to a minor fluctuation in his aura field. Not enough to trigger alarms. Enough to remind him they were there. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger, awareness. Because even compressed, he could feel it. The system wasn't holding him still. It was shaping what still meant. And somewhere beyond that realization, he knew someone else had noticed it too. Aurelion Vale didn't blink as the next data spike appeared. Kim's suppression curve had shifted again. Subtle, but unmistakable. He's changing faster under restriction, Aurelion said softly. Then, quieter. That means the restriction is teaching him. A faint pause followed. Not admiration, not concern, something more persistent. Obsession, in its earliest form, always looked like study, and Aurelion Vale had begun studying him far more than anything else in the world. Chaptered medical threshold. The lead physician didn't sound alarmed when he spoke. That was the worst part. He sounded practiced. His body will remain in a coma state for approximately 1 month, he said, reading the diagnostic panel like it was routine. This is not unexpected given the level of suppressant overuse. The room stayed silent. No one interrupted. No one asked unnecessary questions anymore. When it came to Kim, the physician continued. His aura system is compensating for prolonged artificial suppression. We are beginning to see instability in baseline field regulation. A pause. Then, more carefully, and his natural output signature is becoming irregular. A technician glanced up. Irregular how? Unencored, the physician said. Not uncontrolled yet, but no longer consistent between cycles. That word mattered. Everyone in the room knew it did. Because Kim's aura had never been random. Even when it was dangerous, it was structured, predictable in its evolution. This was the first time it was being described as something that shifted without pattern. The physician hesitated before continuing. There is also a secondary concern. No one likes secondary concerns. If suppressant use continues at the current intensity after recovery, we may reach a point where the suppression system begins causing irreversible structural feedback damage. He tapped the display once, not injury, not failure, a pause, permanent alteration beyond restorative correction thresholds. Silence deepened. Someone finally spoke, quieter now. So if we keep suppressing him, the physician didn't soften it. Yes, he will change in ways we cannot reverse. The room felt smaller after that. Not physically, logically. Inside the sealed recovery chamber below, Kim lay in controlled coma state, not unconscious in the traditional sense, stabilized, held in forced equilibrium, while the system rebuilt itself. Away from conscious interference, the suppressant still flowed through him, slow, regulated, necessary, but even in rest, his body was not still. Micro-adjustments continued beneath the surface, not growth, not decay, recalibration, and somewhere in the background of all that controlled silence, his aura signature flickered again, unstable, not collapsing, not stabilizing, just refusing to return to its previous shape. Far above the medical levels, Aurelion Vale reviewed the updated report as it reached a secured channel. His expression didn't change immediately, but his attention sharpened. 1 month coma, he repeated softly. A pause. From suppression overload, his gaze shifted slightly toward the live readout of Kim's aura field. The fluctuations weren't random, they were directional. Even asleep, Aurelion murmured, he's resisting being defined. That should have been a warning. To most systems, it would have been. But to Aurelion Vale, it was confirmation. He leaned back slightly, eyes still fixed on the data stream. Not concern, not distance. Something closer to fixation that had finally found structure. If they keep suppressing him, he said quietly, they're not controlling him. A faint pause. They're training what he becomes when control breaks. And for the first time since Kim entered the system, Aurelion stopped thinking of him as an anomaly and started thinking of him as a trajectory. Chapter Extended Containment Protocol. The physician didn't announce it as a change. He announced it as a correction. The projected recovery window has been extended. A pause. From 1 month to approximately 3. No one in the room asked why. They already knew. Aurelion Vale stood behind the glass partition, silent. He hadn't touched the system. He hadn't interfered directly, but his presence alone had shifted every model in the facility. Not through force, through recalibration. Kim's parents looked between the readouts and the sealed chamber below. Their son remained in controlled coma state. 8-1 of stabilized apex structure, held in suspended equilibrium. The extension is necessary, the physician continued. His internal system is adapting to quickly under suppressant exposure. If we attempt early reactivation, we risk full structural collapse. Aurelion spoke without turning. And if you maintain suppression? Silence. The physician hesitated. Then we risk long-term deviation from baseline restoration. That was the real decision. Neither option was safe, only survivable in different ways. Kim's mother spoke quietly. He stays under suppression. His father didn't argue, not because he agreed, because there was no alternative left that didn't end in uncertainty. Aurelion finally turned his head slightly. A small pause. You are preserving a version of him that no longer exists, he said. No one responded, because he wasn't wrong. Below them, Kim remained unconscious in controlled stabilization, but not still, never still. Even in coma state, his system continued internal recalibration cycles, suppression fields layered over adaptive growth responses, every cycle pushing against the other, slowly shaping something the system could no longer predict. And Aurelion watched all of it, carefully, quietly, like a man studying inevitability forming in real time. 3 months, he murmured at last, not surprised, measuring, and for the first time, something like anticipation entered his focus. Not for recovery, for what the recovery would no longer be able to contain. Chapter Wake Threshold Failure. 3 months ended without resolution, only accumulation. Kim's body had stabilized in appearance, but not in structure. Every system reading showed the same contradiction. Held at baseline, while continuously exceeding baseline potential, the suppressants were still active, still regulating, still compressing, but the deeper systems no longer agreed with them. Biosignal divergence detected. Recovery and compatibility rising. The physicians should have delayed reawakening again. They didn't, because delaying him further risked collapse in the opposite direction. Aurelion Vale was present when the reactivation protocol began, not invited, not stopped, just allowed, because by now, no one was certain they could afford to restrict him. Kim lay in the center of the stabilized chamber. 8-1. Still, silent. The suppressants began to taper, slowly, carefully, step by step. At first, nothing happened. Then, the system reacted, not awakening, resistance. A sharp spike rolled through the containment field as Kim's internal structure responded to reduced suppression, not violently at first, but instantly aware. Aurelion's gaze sharpened. There it is, he murmured. The aura field surged not outward, but upward through layers of containment, like pressure finding a weak point in a sealed system. Warning: reactivation instability. Biosystem exceeding wake parameters. Kim's fingers twitched, then stopped. The suppressants attempted final stabilization, but it was too late. They had been holding back a system that had already rewritten its own limits. The chamber lights flickered violently, containment fields overloaded, and Kim's body responded with a final recalibration spike. Not as growth yet, but as rejection of the return state itself. Aurelion took a slow step back. Not fear. Assessment. His biology isn't returning to baseline, he said quietly. It's rejecting the idea of one. The system alarms escalated into full failure cascade. And as Kim began to wake, the entire facility realized the truth too late. They hadn't been suppressing him into stability. They had been suppressing him into a shape he no longer fit. And the moment consciousness returned, that shape was about to break. Chapter Containment Break Awakening. The first thing Kim felt was pressure. Not pain, not confusion. Pressure like the world had been holding its breath for too long and finally exhaled against him. His eyes opened halfway. The ceiling above him wasn't a ceiling anymore in his perception. It was a layered system of reinforced expansion plates. Trembling under load, it was no longer fully prepared to interpret. System status reactivation initiated. Suppressant residue active. Biosignal integrity unstable. Kim tried to move. His fingers responded first, then his arm. Slow, heavy, like his body was being reintroduced to itself through resistance. Still here, he muttered. His voice was deeper than before, not stronger, just heavier in the air. And the moment he spoke, the containment field reacted, not violently at first, but instantly. The suppressant still inside his system flared in response to rising internal output, trying to force him back into baseline. The result was immediate contradiction. Two systems fighting inside the same body, one trying to compress, one trying to expand. The chamber lights flickered, then dimmed, then flickered again. Aurelion Vale watched from the observation tier, unmoving. He's awake, he said quietly, but there was no relief in the statement, only confirmation. Below, Kim's breathing deepened once, then stopped for half a second, not collapse. Calibration. His aura surged inward first, then outward, then stabilized somewhere in between like a locked equation refusing simplification. The containment system screamed warnings, not metaphorically, systemically. Critical field conflict. Suppressant failure risk imminent. Kim slowly turned his head. His eyes were open now, fully, gold-green flickers returning beneath, the surface like embers refusing to stay buried. You kept me down too long, he said. Not anger. Fact. The suppressant spiked again, trying to force compliance. His body reacted instantly, not growth yet, but structural recoil, like his system refusing to accept imposed limits anymore. The bed frame beneath him cracked slightly, not from force. From load redistribution the system couldn't calculate fast enough. Aurelion's gaze narrowed. It's not stabilizing, he murmured. It's negotiating. Kim sat up. Slow, controlled, but the moment his spine fully aligned, the air in the chamber shifted. Heavier, denser, not crushing, just aware of him again. The suppressants tried one final override cycle, and failed. A sharp pulse ran through Kim's system. Not expansion, not collapse. Release of constraint. His aura snapped outward across the chamber boundary for the first time in months. Not uncontrolled, unfiltered. Every monitoring screen went red. Containment breach warning. Apex field unbound. Kim's fingers curled slightly against the platform. That's better, he said quietly, and for the first time since his capture into suppression cycles, the system around him stopped pretending it was in control. Aurelion Vale stepped forward one pace, not entering the field, just closer to the edge of it, observing the shift with absolute focus. So this is what they were holding back, he said softly. A pause. No wonder they needed 3 months. Kim looked up toward him, not fully standing yet, but no longer restrained by the same internal limits. The air between them felt different now, not safe, not dangerous, recalibrating, and somewhere deep in the facility systems, a new classification attempt began, then immediately failed, because what had just awakened was no longer matching anything it had been categorized as before, and it was only getting started. Chapter Equal Constants. The chamber no longer felt like containment, it felt like a measurement field. Kim stood fully awake now, no longer in recovery state. The suppressants were gone from active flow, but their residue still lingered in his system like old code refusing to fully uninstall. He could feel everything again, not just strength, not just presence, scale. And across from him, Aurelion Vale remained exactly where he always did, at the edge of Kim's influence range, not stepping closer, not stepping back, like distance itself had been negotiated long before either of them entered the room. You stabilized faster than predicted, Aurelion said quietly. Kim didn't respond immediately. He was still adjusting to being uncompressed, like a structure expanding after long constraint. You were in the system during suppression, Kim said finally, not a question. Aurelion nodded once. I stayed in observation range. Silence followed, not tension, recognition forming shape, because both of them understood something now. No one else in the facility did. Kim wasn't just an anomaly, and Aurelion wasn't just an observer. They were both reference points, constants in systems that stopped behaving normally when the other was present. Kim exhaled once. The air pressure shifted slightly around him, not aggressive, stable now, but unavoidable. Aurelion's gaze tracked it immediately. Your field is synchronizing again, he said. Kim looked at him. It reacts to you. Aurelion didn't deny it. Yours does the same. That was the problem. Not conflict, not danger, resonance. Two systems that refused to settle into isolation. Kim took one step forward. Slow, measured, not to close distance, to test response. The chamber registered it instantly. Field interaction spike, not instability. Alignment strain. Aurelion didn't move, but his presence sharpened slightly, like acknowledging the experiment. You're the first thing that doesn't distort under my output, Kim said quietly. Aurelion's expression shifted faintly. Not surprise, confirmation. And you're the first thing that forces mine to stabilize instead of escalate, he replied. A pause, not emotional, but foundational, because neither of them fit into the systems built around them. But together, they created a pattern the system could finally measure. Kim lowered his gaze slightly. Not submission, processing, then stay within range, he said. Not request, not command, a condition. Aurelion nodded once. I already am. And for the first time, the facility systems didn't flag the interaction as anomaly escalation. They flagged it as stabilization event unknown origin. Because whatever this was, it wasn't love. Not in any language the world could safely define. It was recognition between two things that could not be reduced any further. And the moment they stayed in the same space without collapsing it, the world quietly began adjusting its definitions again. Chapter Mutual Lock. It wasn't love. Neither of them would have defined it that way even if they had wanted to. It was something more precise, more dangerous, more stable. Kim had stopped reacting to most things in the room. The facility, the monitors, the suppressor remnant still embedded in his system. All of it had become background noise again. Except Aurelion Vale. That was the only variable his system refused to flatten. And Aurelion, in return, had stopped treating Kim like a subject. Not because of sentiment, because classification had failed. Repeatedly. You don't destabilize under observation anymore, Aurelion said quietly. Kim stood near the center of the chamber. Neither do you, he replied. That was the first truth they shared without argument. Everything else had variables. This didn't. When Kim moved, the field around him shifted. Not aggressively, not chaotically. But predictably reactive as, if the system now assumed Aurelion's presence as part of its baseline equations. When Aurelion stepped closer, Kim's aura didn't spike. It aligned. The facility didn't know how to label that, so it stopped trying. Status update, non-anomalous interaction unclassifiable. Aurelion studied the readout. They can't define us separately anymore, he said. Kim's gaze lifted slightly. That's their problem. A pause. Not emotional. Not tense. Just shared understanding forming structure, because in a world built to measure extremes, they were becoming each other's reference point, not dependence, not attachment, a locked calibration. Kim exhaled once. The chamber pressure stabilized instantly. Aurelion noticed. You're regulating through proximity now. Kim didn't deny it, because it was true, and because it meant something neither system had accounted for. He didn't need suppression to stabilize anymore, not fully, not alone, and Aurelion Vale, for the first time in recorded observation history, didn't feel like an external variable in Kim's system. He felt like part of the equation, not love, not romance, a mutual lock in a world that kept trying to separate them into controllable pieces. Chapter The Only Constant. The facility had stopped trying to define them, not because it understood them, because every attempt made the data worse. Kim stood in the chamber, no longer restrained, no longer suppressed. He was awake, and for the first time in a long time, stable, not because he was alone, because Aurelion Vale was still within range. Aurelion didn't move when Kim looked at him. He never did unless the system demanded it, and the system had stopped knowing what to demand. You're still here, Kim said quietly, not question. Statement. I said I would be, Aurelion replied. A pause, not tension, something heavier than that, something that made silence feel structured. Kim stepped forward once. The chamber registered the movement instantly. No alarms, no escalation, just recalibration, like the world had started accepting that proximity between them was no longer a threat. It was a condition. Everything stabilizes when you're here, Kim admitted. Aurelion's gaze stayed on him, and everything recalibrates when you're near. That should have been impossible. Two apex systems were not supposed to harmonize. They were supposed to compete, but neither of them competed anymore. Not with each other. Kim exhaled slowly. The air pressure in the room softened in response. Aurelion noticed immediately. You're unconsciously sinking again. Kim didn't deny it this time, because denying it didn't change anything. It only meant the truth stayed unspoken. There was something between them now. Not force, not control, not even understanding in the normal sense. Something quieter, more persistent, like to constants refusing to resolve into separate equations anymore. Aurelian finally stepped closer, just one pace. Not enough to trigger instability, but enough that the system hesitated before updating. They keep trying to measure us separately, he said. Kim looked at him, and failing. A faint pause. Then Aurelian spoke again, lower, more precise. Then they'll eventually have to accept we only function correctly together. That wasn't romance, not officially, not safely defined, but it carried the weight of something that didn't need permission to exist. Kim didn't step back, Aurelian didn't either, and for the first time since the system began watching them, it stopped flagging proximity as danger, it flagged it as inevitability, chaptered reciprocal gravity. It started as a measurement problem. That was how both of them tried to explain it at first. Kim didn't destabilize around Aurelian anymore. That was the first anomaly, and Aurelian, for the first time in recorded existence, didn't feel the need to adjust his presence when Kim entered a room. They were equals now, not in rank, not in origin, but in effect. Two apex fields that no longer overwhelmed each other. They pulled instead of shattered. You're still here, Kim said quietly. He wasn't surprised anymore. He was aware. Aurelian stood across the chamber, watching him like he had stopped pretending this was just observation. I said I would remain within range. A pause. But this silence felt different now, less like distance, more like restraint. Kim stepped forward. No hesitation, no system warning spike, just movement. The air between them adjusted instantly, not collapsing, not resisting, aligning. That was what made it dangerous. Not power, not instability, consistency, because everything in Kim's world had always broken when it got too close. But Aurelian didn't break. He adapted, and Aurelian had the same problem. Everything he touched either submitted or fractured, except Kim didn't do either. He matched. It shouldn't feel like this, Kim said under his breath. Aurelian's gaze didn't move away, and yet it does. That was the truth neither system could suppress. Their presence together didn't escalate chaos anymore. It created structure, a new kind of equilibrium that neither empire nor facility had a model for. Kim stopped a few steps away, close enough now that the chamber system stopped trying to correct their spacing. When you're not here, Kim said quietly, everything feels louder. Aurelian's expression shifted slightly, not surprise, recognition. And when you're absent, he replied, everything becomes predictable again. A pause, longer this time, not tension, awareness, because neither of them had ever been affected like this by another being before. Not like this, not mutual. Kim exhaled once. The air pressure in the room softened in response, unconsciously mirroring his internal state. Aurelian noticed immediately. You're stabilizing through proximity. Kim didn't deny it, because denial no longer applied. I think it's the same for you, Kim said. Aurelian didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, it is. No hesitation, no deflection, just confirmation of something neither of them had a classification for. Kim looked at him for a long moment, not analyzing, not resisting. And Aurelian didn't look away, because at some point between containment reports and anomaly charts, they had stopped being variables and started becoming each other's reference point. This isn't normal, Kim said again, but this time there was no rejection in it. Aurelian stepped forward once, closing the last meaningful distance without crossing into instability thresholds. No, he said. A pause. It isn't. Another silence. But this one didn't feel like waiting. It felt like recognition settling into form. Not control, not submission, not imbalance. Just the apex entities realizing that everything else in the world had started measuring itself around them, and neither of them was stepping away first. Chapter close range. The facility stopped calling it interaction. They started calling it convergence, because whenever Kim and Aurelian were in the same space, everything else became secondary systems. Light stabilized differently, air pressure recalculated, even surveillance algorithms deprioritized every other feed. It wasn't command, it was inevitability. Kim stood closer than before, close enough that the chamber no longer flagged their distance as risk. Not because risk had gone away, but because the system had stopped believing separation was meaningful. Aurelian's gaze stayed on him, unmoving, but not distant anymore. You're doing it again, Aurelian said quietly. Kim didn't ask what it was. He already knew. The pull, the recalibration, the way everything inside him stopped trying to operate independently when Aurelian was near. It's not intentional, Kim replied. A pause. It just happens when you're here. Aurelian's expression shifted slightly, not surprise. Acknowledgement. That's the same for me, he said. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was dense, like the room itself had become aware of the space between them. Kim stepped closer, slow, measured. No system alarms followed, no suppression spikes, just alignment. And that was worse than chaos, because chaos could be controlled. Alignment couldn't. Aurelian didn't step back. He watched Kim close the distance until there was no meaningful space left at the system considered neutral. Do you feel that? Kim asked quietly. Aurelion exhaled once. Yes, not hesitation, not uncertainty, recognition, because whatever this was, it wasn't attraction in the ordinary sense. It wasn't emotion the way humans categorized it. It was something older in structure, something built from scale, pressure, and mirrored existence. The kind of connection that didn't ask permission to exist. It simply became impossible to ignore. Kim's voice lowered slightly. When you're not here, I can think clearly. A pause. But when you are here, I don't want to. Aurelion's eyes narrowed faintly, not in confusion, but focus sharpening. That's not instability, he said quietly. That's recognition. The word landed between them like a seal locking into place. Kim didn't look away. Neither did Aurelion. And for the first time, neither of them treated the silence after that as something that needed to be filled. Because in that silence, everything was already being said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just permanently. The facility system struggled to classify the interaction again, then gave up halfway through the attempt. Status undefined stable loop detected. And in the center of it all, two apex entities remained exactly where they were. Not moving closer, not moving apart, because whatever this was, had already decided the distance for them. Chapter Invitation. The facility expected escalation. Instead, it got something it couldn't model at all. Aurelion Vale didn't approach Kim during an incident. He didn't observe from behind glass. He requested access. Formally, directly, as if the most feared entity in recorded classification. History needed permission to speak on equal ground. Kim arrived alone, no suppressants active, no containment field interference, just him. Aurelion was already there, waiting not in the way of anticipation, but in the way of certainty, like he had already decided this moment would happen, and was simply arriving at its correct time. You asked to see me, Kim said. Aurelion nodded once. I did. A pause. Not tension this time. Clarity. For once, neither of them felt like anomalies in the same space, just two people who no longer destabilized each other. Aurelion studied him for a moment longer than necessary, then spoke calmly. I want to take you somewhere outside this facility. Kim blinked once. Outside. Yes, Aurelion said. Not as containment, not as observation. A faint pause. As equals. That word mattered. Kim didn't respond immediately, not because he didn't understand, because he did. Equal didn't mean identical. It meant neither of them stood above the other in the equation they had become. Where? Kim asked finally. Aurelion's expression shifted slightly, not softened, just more present. A dinner, he said. Somewhere that isn't built to measure either of us. The simplicity of it made the room feel quieter. No systems reacting, no alarms waiting, just intent. Kim exhaled slowly. That's it. Aurelion gave a faint nod. That's it. A pause followed, long enough for the facility beyond the walls to realize something unusual was happening. No one was being tested. No one was being studied. A decision was being made without pressure. Kim looked at him for a long moment. Then, all right. Not hesitation. Not curiosity alone. Acceptance. Aurelion didn't react dramatically. He simply nodded once more, as if confirming a result he already trusted would resolve correctly. Then it's a date, he said quietly. Kim tilted his head slightly. A date. Yes, Aurelion replied. If you accept the term. A faint pause. Then Kim spoke again, quieter. I do. For the first time, the word didn't feel like classification. It felt like choice. And outside the chamber, the systems tried to categorize the interaction, then stopped halfway through. Status, non-anomalous social interaction, unclassifiable relational type. Aurelion stepped back slightly, preparing to leave. Not because the moment was ending, because it was beginning somewhere else. I'll pick a place that doesn't recognize either of us, he said. Kim nodded once. Good. And as Aurelion turned to go, something subtle remained in the space between them. Not pressure, not instability, not obsession. Expectation. Shared. Equal. Intentional. For the first time, neither of them felt like they were being studied by the world, just by each other. Chapter First Dinner outside the system. The city did not recognize either of them. That was intentional. Aurelion chose a place that existed outside most. Registries, an elevated structure in the quieter tier of the metropolis. Far from observation grids that tracked anomaly-level signatures. Not hidden, just ignored by the systems that usually mattered. Kim arrived without escort. No containment protocols. No suppression field. Just himself. For the first time, he noticed how different the world felt when it wasn't trying to correct him. The air didn't resist his presence. It adjusted. Aurelion was already there, seated at a table designed for normal scale, though somehow it didn't look wrong when he occupied it, like the space had quietly accepted adaptation as part of its function. He stood when Kim arrived, not out of formality, out of acknowledgement. You came, Aurelion said. Kim glanced around briefly. No alarms, no systems reacting, just people ordinary, unaware people existing in a world that didn't classify either of them as an active threat. You really picked somewhere blind, Kim said. Aurelion nodded slightly. They don't look for what they've decided isn't there. That made sense in a way that felt almost unsettling. Kim sat. The chair didn't strain. It adjusted subtly under his weight. Distribution like it had been reinforced without announcement. He noticed, didn't comment. Aurelion sat across from him. A pause settled between them. Not heavy like before, just unfamiliar. Outside containment fields and suppression systems, neither of them had a script. A server approached, paused briefly when he saw them. Not fear, confusion like his brain couldn't place either presence into a normal category. Then he recovered and left menus. Kim didn't touch his immediately. He watched Aurelion instead. This is what you meant, he said quietly. Aurelion looked up. By what? Outside, Kim replied, where nothing is measuring us. Aurelion's expression shifted slightly. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something more subtle. Recognition that it was true. Yes, he said. A pause. Then Kim added, it's quieter. It always is, Aurelion replied. Silence followed again, but it wasn't empty. It had structure now, like both of them were learning how to exist without resistance pressing against them. Food arrived. Neither of them rushed. Neither of them performed. At some point, Aurelion spoke again. You adapt differently outside containment. Kim glanced at him. How? Aurelion observed him carefully. Less compression. More continuity. Kim considered that. It feels easier to think. Aurelion nodded. That's because nothing is forcing you to define yourself in real time. That landed deeper than expected. Kim looked down at his hands briefly, then back up. And you? He asked. Aurelion didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, because he was choosing accuracy. When you're not near, he said, everything returns to predictable patterns. A pause. When you are, it doesn't. Kim's gaze sharpened slightly. That's not a problem. No, Aurelion said. A faint pause. It's not. Another silence followed, but this one felt different than before. Less like analysis, more like acknowledgement of something, already agreed upon without needing language for it. Kim leaned back slightly. The space didn't resist him, so this is what a date is, he said. Aurelion's eye stayed on him. It can be. A pause. Then, more quietly, if you want it to be. That word mattered again. Want. Not system requirement. Not anomaly response. Not pressure. Kim looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. I do. Aurelion didn't react strongly. He just held the moment like it was something carefully confirmed, and for the first time, there was no system watching them trying to classify what this meant. No containment interpreting proximity. No suppression correcting behavior. Just two apex entities, sitting across from each other in a world that didn't yet understand what it had stopped being able to measure, and neither of them tried to leave early. It was supposed to be a normal night. That was the cruelest part. 24. Kim had almost started believing that meant something. Not safety, but stability. He and Aurelion were halfway through the upper district crossing when the first disruption hit the air. Not sound, not warning, just intent becoming physical. Kim moved instantly, but this time, it wasn't one attack. It was layered, coordinated, designed. Aurelion barely had time to register the source before Kim was already in front of him. Too fast, too instinctive, like it wasn't a decision anymore. It was a reflex written into him deeper than thought. No, Kim Aurelion started, but the world didn't wait. The impacts came in rapid sequence, not chaotic, controlled, intentional suppression grade fire, and Kim took all of it without stepping back, not because he didn't feel it, because he refused to yield position. Aurelion's expression changed immediately. Not anger, not calculation, something sharper, something real. Stop, he said under his breath, but not to Kim, to the situation itself. Kim's body held, but the strain was visible, now in the smallest details. The way his posture tightened, the way the air around him grew heavier, reacting instinctively to damage and containment pressure at the same time. Aurelion stepped forward, and Kim put a hand out without looking back. Don't, Kim said quietly. One word, not weak. Final. Aurelion froze, not because he was told to, because he understood what Kim was doing. He wasn't protecting him out of strategy. He was doing it because he had decided the outcome already. The attacker stood at the far end of the corridor, no longer hiding, watching, waiting for collapse. You were never meant to stay free, the figure said. Kim finally turned his head slightly toward them, still standing between them and Aurelion, still not falling. That idea stopped mattering a long time ago, he said. The attacker hesitated, just for a second. That was enough, because Aurelion moved, not recklessly, but decisively. The corridor shifted under his presence alone, like the space had finally acknowledged. There were now two apex constants in the same line of existence. He reached Kim in an instant, and for the first time, he didn't hide what he felt. Worry, sharp, immediate, unfiltered. Kim, he said again, quieter now. Why did you step in like that? Kim didn't answer right away, because his breathing had slowed slightly, not collapsing, not failing, just recalibrating under strain. Then, because it wasn't going to hit you, Aurelion went still. That was the problem, not the attack, not even the scale, the decision behind it. The attacker raised their weapon again, but the system around them was already failing to remain coherent. It was supposed to be a normal night. That was the cruelest part. 24. Kim had almost started believing that meant something. Not safety, but stability. He and Aurelion were halfway through the upper district crossing when the first disruption hit the air. Not sound, not warning, just intent becoming physical. Kim moved instantly, but this time, it wasn't one attack. It was layered, coordinated, designed. Aurelion barely had time to register the source before Kim was already in front of him. Too fast, too instinctive, like it wasn't a decision anymore. It was a reflex written into him deeper than thought. No, Kim Aurelion started, but the world didn't wait. The impacts came in rapid sequence, not chaotic, controlled, intentional suppression grade fire, and Kim took all of it without stepping back. Not because he didn't feel it, because he refused to yield position. Aurelion's expression changed immediately. Not anger, not calculation, something sharper, something real. Stop, he said under his breath, but not to Kim, to the situation itself. Kim's body held, but the strain was visible, now in the smallest details. The way his posture tightened, the way the air around him grew heavier, reacting instinctively to damage and containment pressure at the same time. Aurelion stepped forward, and Kim put a hand out without looking back. Don't, Kim said quietly, one word, not weak. Final. Aurelion froze, not because he was told to, because he understood what Kim was doing. He wasn't protecting him out of strategy. He was doing it because he had decided the outcome already. The attacker stood at the far end of the corridor, no longer hiding, watching, waiting for collapse. You were never meant to stay free, the figure said. Kim finally turned his head slightly toward them, still standing between them and Aurelion, still not falling. That idea stopped mattering a long time ago, he said. The attacker hesitated, just for a second. That was enough, because Aurelion moved, not recklessly, but decisively. The corridor shifted under his presence alone, like the space had finally acknowledged. There were now two apex constants in the same line of existence. He reached Kim in an instant, and for the first time, he didn't hide what he felt. Worry, sharp, immediate, unfiltered. Kim, he said again, quieter now, why did you step in like that? Kim didn't answer right away, because his breathing had slowed slightly, not collapsing, not failing, just recalibrating under strain. Then, because it wasn't going to hit you, Aurelion went still. That was the problem, not the attack, not even the scale, the decision behind it. The attacker raised their weapon again, but the system around them was already failing to remain coherent. Not because Kim had fallen, because he hadn't. Aurelion's gaze hardened now, but not toward Kim, toward the figure. You're done, he said quietly, but his hand stayed near Kim, steadying, not forcing, not controlling, just there. Kim finally exhaled, and for the first time in the entire exchange, the aura around him flickered unstable, not from rage, from effort, from holding himself upright through sheer refusal to break in front of Aurelion. Aurelion noticed immediately, and this time, his voice lowered, not command, concern, real, unguarded concern. Don't do that again, he said. Kim glanced at him, a faint pause. Then, quietly, I'm still here. Aurelion didn't answer immediately, because that wasn't the issue. The issue was that Kim always chose to stay there anyway. And that was when the world broke again. Not from the attackers, not from the fight, but from below the street. A silence drop in the environment, like something old had just reactivated. Kim felt it before he saw it. His expression changed slightly. That's not them. Aurelion's gaze sharpened instantly. No, the ground beneath them didn't explode. It opened, clean, precise, like the city had remembered something it was built to do. A containment field snapped into existence around Kim before he could fully react. Not attacking him, recognizing him. His body stiffened immediately, not from pain, from familiarity. No, Kim said under his breath. Not fear, recognition. Because this wasn't the attackers, this was something older, something that already had authority in his system. Hands caught him from below the threshold. Efficient, controlled, and Aurelion moved instantly, but the structure sealed faster than even he could fully intercept. Not locked, accepted, as if Kim's existence had a prior claim registered, somewhere deeper than the present world. Kim, Aurelion's voice cut sharply through the corridor. Too late. Kim was pulled downward through reactivated underground infrastructure, the suppressor field igniting as his system tried to fight instinctively. But something deeper slowed him, not weakness, memory. The last thing he saw above ground was Aurelion breaking toward the entry point, not calm anymore, fully exposed now, and then the world dropped away. Below, the underground facility lit up, sterile, rebuilt, familiar in a way that made his system hesitate before resisting. And waiting there were his parents, not as people, as operators. This is stabilization protocol, his mother said quietly, not emotional. Final, he cannot remain in this state after external contamination, his father added. Kim tried to move, tried to speak, but the suppressor field activated fully now. Chapter Quiet Override. The underground chamber didn't feel like a place. It felt like a system that had never stopped running. Kim could barely hold himself upright anymore. not because he had stopped trying, because his body was no longer agreeing with him. Everything felt distant, heavy in a way that wasn't pain anymore, just absence of momentum. The earlier damage hadn't broken him all at once, it had drained him, slowly pulling the edge off his awareness, until even standing felt optional. His vision blurred at the corners, the sterile lights above him didn't flicker, he just stopped processing them correctly. You don't have to resist, his mother said softly. Kim didn't answer right away. It took effort just to focus on her voice. That's what you always say, he muttered finally. Not anger, exhaustion. His father adjusted something on the console beside him. We're stabilizing the injuries first, he said. Then we restore baseline containment. The words didn't land the way they used to. They floated. Kim shifted slightly and immediately felt how little strength was actually left in the motion. Not collapse yet, just awareness that collapse was available at any second. He exhaled slowly, longer than he meant to. I'm tired, he said quietly. That was the first real break in him. Not panic, not defiance, just admission. The room didn't respond emotionally. It responded procedurally. Begin stabilization, his father said. A suppressor sequence activated. Not sudden, not violent, controlled, and his body recognized it immediately. That was the worst part. Familiar pathways lit up inside him, old ones, buried ones like his system remembered. How to surrender resistance before his mind could argue. No, he tried again, but it came out weaker this time. Less command, more fading signal. His legs finally gave slightly under him. Not dramatic, just inevitability catching up. And for a moment, just a moment, he looked almost young again. Not in age, in distance, like the fight had been stripped away long enough for everything else to show through. Then the system tightened, not violently, systematically. Hours passed like that. Time didn't move for him, it compressed, until something in the system began to fail. Not in the chamber, inside him. The suppressants were doing their job too well, holding too tightly, forcing his biology into a state it no longer fit. The result wasn't silence, it was conflict. Deep, internal pressure with nowhere to go. Monitors began to spike. Something's wrong, one technician said sharply. No, his father replied after checking. It's exceeding tolerance response. Kim's mother stared at the readings longer. Then quietly, increase suppression cycle depth. The system obeyed, and that was the moment everything shifted. Because far above ground, Aurelion Vale woke, not from sleep, from recognition. Something in his bloodline ancient, buried beneath restraint ignited. Not rage, not instinct alone, bond recognition. Kim, he said quietly, his eyes opened fully as the world around him bent subtly, as if reality itself recalculated his presence. And in that moment, his restraint broke into purpose. He moved, fast enough that the city systems failed to classify him correctly, because what was coming now wasn't just rescue, it was inevitability. Below ground, Kim's condition destabilized further. Not conscious, not asleep, something in between, a coma state fluctuation, unstable and deep, and within that unstable threshold, his body reacted again, not violently, not cleanly. A subtle apex shift passed through him, enough that systems registered structural change, enough that even the monitors hesitated. A slight increase in scale, not dramatic, just undeniable, like his body refused to remain entirely within its previous limits, even while unconscious. At the same time, his presence intensified, not outwardly controlled, but leaking through suppression layers that were no longer fully sufficient. Technicians froze. He's still changing under suppression, one said quietly. That shouldn't be possible, another replied, but the readings didn't care what should or shouldn't happen. The chamber alarm spiked again, because the system was no longer stabilizing him. It was containing something it could not fully define anymore, and that instability carried weight, pressure, presence, enough that even the people around the console instinctively stepped back. Not fear of injury, fear of scale. Meanwhile, Aurelion broke into the underground network. Doors didn't resist him properly. Systems failed to finalize authorization checks before he was already past them, as if the facility was remembering too late that it had ever been built to contain something like him. Inside the chamber, Kim's instability spiked again, not waking, but deepening into that uncontrolled threshold where suppression and evolution collided, and Aurelion felt it like a pull in his bloodline. I'm here, he said quietly, not to the room, not to the system, to Kim, because now it wasn't distance that mattered anymore. It was timing, and the world was running out of it. The chamber alarms didn't stop. They only changed tone, because Kim wasn't stabilizing anymore. He was pressing against the limits of containment without moving at all. Even in the coma state fluctuation, something inside him continued to shift. Not awake, not conscious, but still upgrading against restraint. The first sign wasn't on the monitors. It was in the room itself. The containment bed creaked, not softly, not subtly. A sharp structural protest, like the frame had just realized the weight it was holding no longer matched its design parameters. The support frame is failing, one technician said quickly. That's impossible, another snapped. It's rated for Apex class load stability, but the readings didn't care about ratings. Kim's body wasn't collapsing, it was becoming heavier in a way the system couldn't categorize. Not just mass, not just pressure, something deeper like presence itself was gaining density. The bed shifted again, then dipped slightly at the center, metal joints tightened, then groaned under recalibration strain. A faint crack echoed through the frame, not breaking yet, but close enough to make everyone in the room step back instinctively. His mother stared at the readouts. Why is his output still increasing during suppression? No one answered immediately, because there wasn't a clean answer in the system logs anymore. Kim's form remained still, eyes closed, breathing shallow, but the world around him continued reacting, like he was becoming too large for it to measure properly. The surrounding equipment flickered. Not failure, correction lag. Even the air pressure in the chamber shifted slightly, like the room itself was adjusting to accommodate something it didn't fully understand. He's expanding again, a technician said under their breath. Not loudly, not confidently, like saying it too clearly might make it worse. And then it happened, a second structural strain wave. The bed didn't break, but it sank lower, stabilizers locking in late as reinforcement systems struggled to compensate. The sound of metal tension filled the chamber for a long moment. Everyone went silent, because it wasn't just equipment reacting anymore. It was instinct, the same instinct that told every person in the room, without needing confirmation. He was still growing, still changing, still becoming something the containment system was no longer fully equipped to hold. And far above ground, Aurelion felt it mid-descent, not through sensors, not through data, through bond pressure. His expression sharpened instantly. Kim, he said quietly, and this time, there was no hesitation left in him at all, because whatever was happening below was no longer just stabilization failure, it was transformation under restraint. Chapter, Vital Failure Protocol. The system didn't announce it as danger at first, it tried to correct it. Kim's vitals simply stopped behaving like a stable pattern. Not all at once, not cleanly, they began to drift, then spike, then fall. We're losing coherence in his biological rhythm, one technician said, voice tightening. That's not possible under suppression, his father snapped. But the monitor didn't agree. The numbers kept collapsing in on themselves, like the body was forgetting how to maintain a consistent state. Kim lay motionless in the chamber, but now, even stillness looked wrong, like something inside him was burning through its remaining structure just to keep existing. The suppressants weren't stabilizing him anymore. They were overloading what was left. Heart rhythm irregular, a voice said. Then, system failure pattern increasing. His mother stepped closer to the glass. For the first time, her expression changed. Not fear, recognition that control had ended. He's going into collapse state, she said quietly, and somewhere above ground, Aurelion Vale felt it instantly. Not distance, not signal, loss. His body moved before thought finished forming. The world around him bent, air pressure dropping in his wake as he crossed space faster than systems could track. Kim, the name wasn't spoken this time. It was reaction. Below, alarms finally broke into full panic response. Vitals are failing. Suppressants are destabilizing his entire system. We can't correct this fast enough. But it was already too late for correction. Kim's condition wasn't stabilizing anymore. It was unthreading. And then, a shift in the chamber air. Not mechanical, not procedural, predatory recognition. Aurelion arrived. The doors didn't open for him. They stopped resisting reality and simply allowed him through. He didn't look at the staff. He didn't look at the systems. Only Kim. For a second, everything in the room went still. Even the alarms felt distant. He's not surviving the state, Aurelion said quietly. Not question. Fact. Kim's vitals dropped again. A deeper collapse wave. The system tried one last suppressor cycle. It failed mid-execution. Aurelion stepped closer. His expression changed, not soft, not gentle. Focused, ancient instinct finally allowed to surface fully. This isn't rejection, he murmured. It's incompatibility. His gaze lowered to Kim's unconscious form. Then, quieter, you were never meant to be held like this. Behind him, someone shouted something about restraint protocols. No one obeyed, because even they could feel it now. The system had lost authority over what was happening. Aurelion placed a hand near Kim's wrist. Not forceful, not controlling. Then he leaned in. The bite wasn't violence. It was activation of a bonded survival mechanism, a transfer response encoded in his bloodline long before either of them existed in this timeline of control. A brief contact, a pulse of energy recognition, a stabilization link locking into place. Kim's vitals stuttered, then paused, then stabilized imperfectly, but enough to stop the immediate collapse. The monitors screamed as systems tried to classify what just happened. What did he just do? Someone whispered. Chapter, Vital Failure Protocol. The system didn't announce it as danger at first. It tried to correct it. Kim's vitals simply stopped behaving like a stable pattern. Not all at once, not cleanly. They began to drift, then spike, then fall. We're losing coherence in his biological rhythm, one technician said, voice tightening. That's not possible under suppression, his father snapped. But the monitor didn't agree. The numbers kept collapsing in on themselves, like the body was forgetting how to maintain a consistent state. Kim lay motionless in the chamber, but now, even stillness looked wrong. Like something inside him was burning through its remaining structure just to keep existing. The suppressants weren't stabilizing him anymore. They were overloading what was left. Heart rhythm irregular, a voice said. Then, system failure pattern increasing. His mother stepped closer to the glass. For the first time, her expression changed. Not fear, recognition that control had ended. He's going into collapse state, she said quietly, and somewhere above ground, Aurelion Vale felt it instantly. Not distance, not signal, loss. His body moved before thought finished forming. The world around him bent, air pressure dropping in his wake as he crossed space faster than systems could track. Kim, the name wasn't spoken this time. It was reaction. Below, alarms finally broke into full panic response. Vitals are failing. Suppressants are destabilizing his entire system. We can't correct this fast enough. But it was already too late for correction. Kim's condition wasn't stabilizing anymore. It was unthreading. And then, a shift in the chamber air. Not mechanical, not procedural, predatory recognition. Aurelion arrived. The doors didn't open for him. They stopped resisting reality and simply allowed him through. He didn't look at the staff. He didn't look at the systems. Only Kim. For a second, everything in the room went still. Even the alarms felt distant. He's not surviving the state, Aurelion said quietly. Not question. Fact. Kim's vitals dropped again. A deeper collapse wave. The system tried one last suppressor cycle. It failed mid-execution. Aurelion stepped closer. His expression changed, not soft, not gentle. Focused, ancient instinct finally allowed to surface fully. This isn't rejection, he murmured. It's incompatibility. His gaze lowered to Kim's unconscious form. Then, quieter, you were never meant to be held like this. Behind him, someone shouted something about restraint protocols. No one obeyed, because even they could feel it now. The system had lost authority over what was happening. Aurelion placed a hand near Kim's wrist. Not forceful, not controlling. Then he leaned in. The bite wasn't violence. It was activation of a bonded survival mechanism, a transfer response encoded in his bloodline long before either of them existed in this timeline of control. A brief contact, a pulse of energy recognition, a stabilization link locking into place. Kim's vitals stuttered, then paused, then stabilized imperfectly, but enough to stop the immediate collapse. The monitors screamed as systems tried to classify what just happened. What did he just do? Someone whispered. His mother stepped back slightly. For the first time uncertain, Aurelion didn't move away. His eyes stayed on Kim. I claim the only state his body can survive in, he said quietly. Another pause. Now he has a chance to come back. Kim's breathing didn't fully return, but it didn't vanish either. And for the first time since the collapse began, the system stopped counting down. It started recalculating.